They said I came back from deployment broken and homeless, sleeping on couches because I couldn't hold down a real job, that I was the family embarrassment they had to tolerate at holiday dinners, but nothing prepared me for the moment I walked into my cousin's Thanksgiving party wearing thrift store clothes, and the real estate mogul across the room looked up from his wine glass and said, "You're Sophia Martinez, aren't you? You own half of Beverly Hills." And just like that, the room full of relatives who'd been whispering about my failures went completely silent. They said I came back from deployment broken and homeless, sleeping on couches because I couldn't hold down a real job. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, that I was the family embarrassment they had to tolerate at holiday dinners, but nothing prepared me for the moment I walked into my cousin's Thanksgiving party wearing thrift store clothes, and the real estate mogul across the room looked up from his wine glass and said, "You're Sophia Martinez, aren't you? You own half of Beverly Hills." And just like that, the room full of relatives who'd been whispering about my failures went completely silent. I know some people think family humiliation has to be dramatic, public scenes, thrown dishes, screaming matches across crowded restaurants. But sometimes it's just a quiet assassination over turkey and stuffing. Sometimes it's sitting at the kids' table at 29 because your cousin Jessica decided you weren't successful enough to sit with the real adults. Sometimes it's listening to your own relatives discuss your failures like you're not even in the room. "Poor Sophia," Jessica had said to her husband loud enough for everyone to hear as I walked through her front door that Thursday evening. 3 years out of the military and still can't get her life together. I heard she's been couch surfing since she got back from Afghanistan because she can't afford rent anywhere decent. The words hit like an IED blast, sudden and devastating. I stood there in the marble foyer of Jessica's McMansion in Orange County, clutching the bottle of wine I'd scraped together money to buy, wearing the only nice outfit I owned, a blazer and pants from Goodwill that almost hid how much weight I'd lost since leaving the Army. Around the living room, my extended family nodded in that mixture of pity and judgment that made my chest tight. Aunt Carmen whispered something to Uncle Roberto about, quote, "what the military does to people." My younger cousin Michael, fresh out of his MBA program, shook his head like I was a cautionary tale he'd learned about in business school. "She's been applying to jobs for months," Jessica continued, her voice dripping with the kind of concern that felt more like performance art. "But you know how it is with veterans. All that trauma, all those issues, employers can tell something's off. Something's off." As if serving 2 tours in Afghanistan, managing supply chains in active combat zones, and coordinating logistics for 1,000-person military operations were character defects, instead of the reason they could all sit in their comfortable suburban homes arguing about football scores. But what hurt most wasn't the judgment from my extended family. It was the fact that Jessica, who used to call me her hero cousin when I was deployed, had become the loudest voice in writing me off. The same person who'd posted my military photos on social media with captions about family pride was now treating me like a charity case she was obligated to invite out of politeness. I sat at that dining room table, surrounded by conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes, and felt smaller than I ever had during mortar attacks in Kandahar. Because enemy fire might kill your body, but family shame kills something deeper. It kills the part of you that believes you belong anywhere, that you're worth more than the sum of your visible struggles. "Maybe next year will be better for you, Sophia," Jessica said as she passed the mashed potatoes, her tone suggesting she didn't really believe it. "Maybe you'll finally find something stable. Something that fits your limitations." My limitations. As if leading convoy operations through hostile territory and managing million-dollar military budgets were limitations, instead of skills that most people couldn't handle on their best day. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded and focused on my plate, while my family continued their dinner conversation around me like I was invisible. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they saw a homeless veteran collecting unemployment, I'd been building something they couldn't even imagine. Something that would change everything they thought they knew about success, about worth, about the cousin they'd given up on. Whether shapen nan tora zikoyu what happened next. Mia bata chaped mia ta. I hadn't been to Jessica's house since her housewarming party 2 years ago, back when I was still in uniform and she'd introduced me to everyone as her badass military cousin. But standing in her driveway that Thanksgiving evening, Staring up at the two-story colonial with its perfectly manicured lawn and German luxury cars, I felt like I was entering enemy territory. The house smelled of expensive candles, roasted turkey, and the kind of success that came with dual incomes and no student loans. My worn sneakers, the only shoes that didn't have holes, made soft squeaks against the hardwood floors as I followed the sound of laughter and clinking wine glasses. These same floors where Jessica had once told me I was her inspiration, where she'd asked endless questions about military life and my exciting adventures overseas. This time I wasn't here as the celebrated veteran or the family success story. I was here because my mother had guilted me into coming. It's Thanksgiving, Sophia. Family is family. Jessica specifically asked about you, she'd said, though I suspected Jessica's invitation had more to do with maternal pressure than genuine interest in my company. The living room was full of the usual suspects. My cousins, their spouses, their perfectly dressed children who attended private schools and took violin lessons. Everyone looked prosperous, comfortable, settled. Everything I apparently wasn't. Before I could even set down the wine bottle I'd brought, Jessica intercepted me in the hallway, her smile bright but her eyes calculating. She was wearing what looked like a designer dress and jewelry that probably cost more than I'd made in the last 6 months. "Sophia, you came," she said, loud enough to announce my arrival to the entire house. "Everyone, look who finally made it. Our wandering soldier." The way she said wandering made it sound like I was some kind of vagrant who'd stumbled in from the street. I forced a smile and offered her the wine bottle, suddenly aware of how cheap the label looked compared to the bottles already open on her granite countertops. "Thanks for having me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your house looks beautiful." "Oh, this old place," Jessica waved dismissively, though I knew she and her husband had bought it for $800,000 just 3 years ago. "We're actually looking at upgrading soon. Brian's practice is doing so well, and with my marketing consulting taking off," she trailed off meaningfully. The subtext was clear. "Look how successful we are. Look how much we've accomplished while you've been struggling." Jessica guided me toward the kitchen, where the other wives were arranging appetizers and gossiping about mutual friends. "Girls, you remember my cousin Sophia. She's the one who was in Afghanistan." The way she said it made military service sound like a stint in rehab rather than something to be proud of. The other women smiled politely and made brief eye contact before returning to their conversations about children's school districts and vacation plans. "Sophia's been transitioning back to civilian life," Jessica continued, her voice carrying that careful tone people use when discussing someone's unfortunate circumstances. "It's been challenging. The job market is so tough for veterans, you know? All that specialized military training doesn't always translate to the real world." I stood there listening to her explain my life to people who didn't care, feeling like an exhibit in a museum of family dysfunction. Around me, successful people discussed successful things while I tried to blend into the granite backsplash. But what struck me most wasn't the condescension or the pity. It was how completely Jessica had rewritten our history. The same person who used to brag about having a cousin in the military, who'd shown my deployment photos to her friends like trophies, was now presenting my service as the beginning of my downfall. That's when I noticed him. A man in an expensive suit standing by the sliding glass doors, holding a wine glass and looking slightly out of place among Jessica's suburban crowd. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested serious money rather than the performed success that filled the rest of the room. And he was staring directly at me, with an expression I couldn't quite read. The man in the expensive suit approached me with the measured steps of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. Up close, I could see the quality of his tailoring, the kind of understated luxury that spoke louder than Jessica's obvious designer labels. "Excuse me," he said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I'm Richard Blackstone. I couldn't help but overhear. You're Sophia Martinez?" Before I could answer, Jessica appeared beside us like she'd been monitoring my conversations from across the room. "Oh, Richard, I see you've met my cousin." "Sophia, this is Richard Blackstone. He's one of the biggest real estate developers in Los Angeles. His company built half of downtown." She said it with the kind of breathless excitement people reserve for meeting celebrities, clearly hoping some of his success would reflect well on her for knowing him. Richard, Sophia is the cousin I was telling you about, the one who's been having such a hard time since leaving the military. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. Jessica had been discussing my personal struggles with strangers at her dinner party, turning my life into casual conversation fodder for people I'd never met. Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something I couldn't identify. "Having a hard time?" he repeated, his voice careful and neutral. "Well, you know how it is with veterans," Jessica continued, oblivious to my discomfort. "All that trauma, the difficulty adjusting to normal life. Sophia's been unemployed for months now. Living situation has been unstable. We're all just hoping she can find something eventually." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Unstable. Eventually. As if I was a charity case that required the family's collective patience and low expectations. And Beck. "I've been offering to help her with interview prep," Jessica added, her voice taking on that performative kindness again. "Maybe help her understand how to present herself better to potential employers. Sometimes veterans don't realize how their military experience can come across as intimidating to civilian hiring managers." Richard set down his wine glass with deliberate precision, his eyes never leaving my face. "Intimidating," he repeated slowly. "Oh yes," Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "All that military training, the intensity, the way they're taught to think about everything as a mission or operation, it can be off-putting in normal business environments. Sophia's learning to tone it down, aren't you?" Tone it down. As if my ability to lead operations under extreme pressure was a personality flaw that needed correction rather than a skill set most people would never possess. I stood there listening to Jessica explain to this successful businessman why I was fundamentally unemployable, why my military service had damaged rather than developed me, why I needed to be fixed before I could contribute to society. Every word felt like a small betrayal, delivered with a smile and wrapped in concern. "Actually," Richard said, his voice cutting through Jessica's monologue with quiet authority, "I'm curious about something." He turned to face me directly, ignoring Jessica entirely. "Sophia, what was your role in Afghanistan?" The question caught me off guard. Most people asked generic questions about what it was like over there, or offered generic thanks for my service. They didn't ask for specifics. "I was a logistics coordinator," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I managed supply chains and resource allocation for forward operating bases." "Resource allocation," Richard nodded thoughtfully. "That involves significant financial oversight, doesn't it? Budget management, cost analysis, strategic planning." Jessica shifted uncomfortably beside us. This wasn't the direction she'd expected the conversation to take. "Yes, sir," I continued, feeling more confident. "I oversaw multi-million-dollar budgets, coordinated with international suppliers, managed inventory systems for essential resources under time-critical conditions." Richard's smile was subtle but unmistakable. "Time-critical conditions," he repeated. "That sounds like excellent preparation for high-stakes business environments." The silence that followed was loaded with tension I didn't understand. Jessica's smile had become strained, and Richard was studying me with an intensity that made me feel like he was seeing something no one else in this room had bothered to look for. Jessica's discomfort with the direction of our conversation was becoming increasingly obvious. She laughed nervously and placed a protective hand on my arm, the gesture feeling more possessive than supportive. "Well, military experience is one thing," she said, her voice carrying that careful tone people use when trying to redirect a conversation back to safer territory. "But civilian business is completely different, isn't it? All those corporate protocols, office politics, the need for formal education and professional networks. Sophia's been learning that the hard way." Richard raised an eyebrow. "The hard way?" "Oh, you know," Jessica continued, warming to her subject. "She's been applying for entry-level positions for months, with no luck. Administrative assistant roles, customer service, that sort of thing. But even for those jobs, employers want college degrees now, professional references, people who understand how things work in the real world. Entry-level positions." The dismissal in her voice was unmistakable. In Jessica's mind, my military logistics experience qualified me for nothing more than answering phones and filing paperwork. The real world, Richard repeated, his tone carefully neutral. And what makes someone qualified to operate in this real world? Jessica brightened, clearly thinking she'd found a sympathetic audience for her theories about my inadequacies. Education, primarily. Professional development, networking, understanding corporate culture, the kind of skills you get from climbing the ladder in established companies. She gestured around the room, where her husband was discussing his dental practice with Uncle Roberto, where her sister-in-law was explaining her success in pharmaceutical sales. Everyone here has built their careers through traditional paths: college, internships, working their way up through legitimate businesses. That's how you build credibility. Credibility, I repeated quietly, feeling that familiar sting of being discussed like I wasn't standing right there. Exactly, Jessica nodded enthusiastically. And unfortunately, military service, while we're all grateful for it, of course, doesn't provide that kind of foundation. It's such an isolated environment, so removed from normal business operations. The skills just don't translate. Richard's smile had become sharper. I see. And what about real estate experience? Property management, investment analysis, market evaluation. Would those skills translate to civilian business? Jessica looked confused by the sudden shift. Well, yes, obviously. Real estate requires sophisticated financial analysis, risk assessment, understanding market dynamics. But Sophia doesn't have any background in... She stopped mid-sentence, suddenly uncertain. Doesn't have any background in what? Richard asked gently. In real estate, Jessica finished weakly, though her confidence was clearly wavering. Richard turned back to me, his expression unreadable. Sophia, I'm curious about your living situation. Jessica mentioned it's been unstable. Where exactly are you staying these days? The question felt loaded, though I couldn't understand why. Jessica shifted beside me, her protective hand on my arm tightening slightly. I've been moving around, I said carefully, aware that everyone within earshot was now listening to our conversation. Staying in different places, trying to figure out my next steps. Different places, Richard nodded thoughtfully. And these places? Are they rental properties? Family homes? Something else? Jessica jumped in before I could answer. She's been couch surfing, basically, staying with friends when she can, sometimes in extended stay motels when she can't. It's been really difficult for her to establish stability. But Richard wasn't looking at Jessica. His eyes remained fixed on mine, and there was something in his expression that made me think he already knew the answer to his question. Extended stay motels, he repeated slowly. That must be expensive on an unemployment budget. The silence stretched between us, filled with implications I didn't understand. Around us, the Thanksgiving dinner conversation continued, but I had the distinct feeling that something significant was happening in this small circle by the sliding glass doors. Yes, I said finally. It has been expensive. Richard's smile was subtle but unmistakable. I imagine it would be, unless of course someone had other resources to draw from. I excused myself from the conversation and walked to Jessica's bathroom, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Richard Blackstone's probing questions felt intentional, like he was fishing for something specific. But what could a real estate mogul possibly want with someone Jessica had spent the evening describing as a homeless veteran? I locked the bathroom door and pulled out my phone, my hands steadier than they'd been all evening. Something about Richard's intensity, the way he'd asked about my resources, had triggered the same analytical instincts that kept me alive in Afghanistan. When something doesn't add up, you investigate. I Googled Richard Blackstone Real Estate Los Angeles and found exactly what Jessica had described, one of the most powerful property developers on the West Coast. Blackstone Properties had built half of downtown LA's financial district, owned commercial real estate across 3 states, and was worth an estimated $2.3 billion. But it was the third search result that made my pulse quicken. Blackstone Properties acquires military housing development portfolio. The article was 18 months old, detailing how his company had purchased a massive collection of properties originally built for veteran housing initiatives. I kept scrolling, and the pieces started forming a pattern. Multiple articles about Blackstone's investments in, quote, undervalued residential properties with military connections. A business magazine profile describing his unconventional approach to property acquisition, and his ability to identify valuable assets that other investors overlook. Then I found it. A small news item from 3 years ago. Local veteran uses military savings to purchase distressed properties in Beverly Hills area. The article was brief, mentioning an unnamed veteran who had bought several rundown properties through VA loan programs and was quietly renovating them. The properties were described as formerly high-value real estate in various stages of foreclosure. My throat tightened. 3 years ago. Right after I'd returned from my second deployment with a significant amount of combat pay savings and a deep desire to never depend on anyone else for housing again. I opened my banking app and scrolled through 3 years of financial records, my heart hammering as I saw the pattern of my own decisions laid out in transaction history. Property purchases, renovation loans, property management fees, rental income deposits that had been automatically transferred to separate investment accounts. Accounts I rarely checked because I'd been living off my smaller military disability payments to maintain the appearance of financial struggle. The bathroom door handle rattled. "Sophia? You okay in there?" Jessica's voice carried that concerned family member tone that had become so familiar. "Fine," I called back, quickly closing my banking app. "Be right out." But I wasn't fine. I was starting to understand that the conversation with Richard hadn't been random small talk. Somehow, he knew something about my financial situation that I'd been carefully hiding from my family for 3 years. I walked back to the living room, where Richard was now standing alone by the fireplace, Jessica having been pulled away by her husband to help serve dessert. He looked up when I approached, and his expression was knowing. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked quietly. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you are." He sipped his wine thoughtfully. "Property records are public information, Sophia. So are business licenses, incorporation documents, and real estate transactions. Especially when they involve interesting patterns." My stomach dropped. "What kind of patterns?" "The kind where someone very quietly buys distressed properties in some of the most expensive zip codes in California, renovates them using contractors with military connections, and rents them out through property management companies that happen to specialize in veterans' housing." The room suddenly felt too warm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Richard's smile was gentle but sharp. "Martinez Property Holdings, LLC, incorporated 2.5 years ago. Current portfolio includes 12 residential properties in Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, and Santa Monica. Estimated market value." He paused, watching my face. "Well, let's just say it's significantly more than the cost of extended stay motels." I stared at him, my carefully constructed cover story crumbling around me. For 3 years, I'd let my family believe I was struggling financially while I quietly built a real estate empire with my military savings and VA loan benefits. I lived modestly, dressed down, and never corrected their assumptions about my circumstances. "How did you know?" Richard finished. "Because I've been trying to buy 3 of your properties for the past 6 months. My acquisitions team keeps running into the same problem. The owner won't return our calls." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Richard Blackstone, one of the most powerful real estate developers in Los Angeles, had been trying to buy my properties. Properties that my family didn't even know I owned. "Your acquisitions team," I repeated slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. 3 properties specifically," Richard continued, his voice low enough that our conversation remained private despite the dinner party continuing around us. "A 1920s Spanish colonial on North Beverly Drive that you bought for $280,000 and renovated into a stunning 4-bedroom. A mid-century modern in West Hollywood that you transformed from a foreclosure disaster into a $1.2 million showpiece. And a duplex in Santa Monica that's been fully rented for 2 years with a waiting list." Each property description hit like a physical blow. He knew details about my investments that I'd never shared with anyone. Purchase prices, renovation timelines, rental income. Information that was technically public but required serious research to compile. "We've been leaving messages with Martinez Property Holdings for months," he said, studying my face carefully. "Offering well above market value, actually. Our initial offer was $3.8 million for just those 3 properties." My knees nearly buckled. $3.8 million for 3 properties out of the 12 I owned. While my family sat around this dinner table discussing my unemployment and homelessness, Richard Blackstone's company had been trying to buy nearly $4 million worth of my real estate portfolio. But here's what's really interesting, Richard continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone solving a puzzle. The renovation work on all your properties was done by the same contractor, Rodriguez Construction, a veteran-owned business that specializes in military housing rehabilitation. Every permit, every inspection, every city filing shows the same pattern: strategic improvements that maximize both property value and rental income. I felt dizzy. How do you know all this? Because I make it my business to know who the smart investors are in this market, Richard said with a slight smile. And your portfolio shows the kind of strategic thinking that most people spend decades learning. You didn't just buy random properties. You identified undervalued assets in high appreciation neighborhoods, timed your purchases during market dips, and executed renovations that doubled or tripled property values. Just then, Jessica's laugh rang out from the dining room, where she was telling someone about my struggles with basic employment. The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. While she explained to her guests why I couldn't handle a simple job, I was standing 10 feet away discussing multi-million-dollar real estate transactions with one of the most successful developers in California. There's something else, Richard said, pulling out his phone. I had my team pull the complete portfolio analysis. Martinez Property Holdings doesn't just own 12 properties. The business model is fascinating. You've created a sustainable housing network specifically for veterans transitioning to civilian life, below-market rents, flexible lease terms, properties located near VA facilities, and veteran support services. He showed me a spreadsheet on his phone screen that mapped out my entire business operation with military precision. Every property location, every rental rate, every strategic decision I'd made was laid out in clean columns and rows. This isn't just real estate investing, Richard said quietly. This is social impact investing with a military logistics approach. You've created a system that generates substantial returns while solving a real problem for the veteran community. I stared at the spreadsheet, seeing my work reflected back through the eyes of someone who understood its value. For 3 years, I'd been quietly building something meaningful while my family saw only surface-level struggling. The woman your cousin has been describing as unemployable, Richard said, appears to be one of the most strategically minded property investors I've encountered in 20 years of real estate development. The recognition in his voice was something I hadn't heard from anyone in my family since returning from Afghanistan. Not pity, not concern, not condescension. Just professional respect from someone who understood what I'd accomplished. So, Richard said, his eyes twinkling with what looked like amusement, about those acquisition offers. Are you interested in discussing them? That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of anxiety, but because my mind was racing with the implications of Richard's recognition. I sat in my car in Jessica's driveway, scrolling through my property management app and seeing my real estate empire through new eyes. Not as the secret I'd been keeping, but as the achievement I'd been hiding. But Richard's knowledge raised questions that made my military-trained instincts prickle with suspicion. How had he connected me to Martinez Property Holdings when I'd been so careful to maintain operational security? I'd used my middle name and maiden name for the business registration, worked through intermediaries, and kept all communications through my property manager. I drove home to my actual residence, not a couch or extended stay motel, but a renovated craftsman bungalow in Culver City that I'd bought with my first VA loan, and opened my laptop. Time to conduct a proper intelligence gathering operation. First, I pulled the visitor logs for my properties. Property management companies keep detailed records of who tours buildings, who makes inquiries, who requests information. What I found made my stomach drop. Over the past 8 months, representatives from Blackstone Acquisitions had toured 7 of my 12 properties. But they hadn't just looked at the buildings. They'd asked detailed questions about the owner, the business model, the tenant demographics. Questions that went far beyond standard due diligence. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. Buried in my property manager's communication logs was an email from 6 months ago. Inquiry: Martinez Holdings ownership verification from someone at Family Research Associates. Family Research Associates wasn't a real estate company. A quick search revealed it was a private investigation firm that specialized in discreet background verification for family members and concerned parties. Someone in my family had hired investigators to look into my financial situation. I dug deeper, cross-referencing dates and communications. The timeline was damning. The private investigation started 3 months after Jessica's birthday party, where I declined to contribute to an expensive group gift because I was unemployed. 2 weeks later, family research associates began making inquiries about my business activities, but the smoking gun was in my email archives. A message I'd almost deleted from 8 months ago, from an address I didn't recognize. Sophia, this is Brian, Jessica's husband. Hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. Jess mentioned you've been having a hard time financially. My dental practice has been doing well, and we'd like to help family. Would you be open to discussing some temporary financial assistance? We could keep it between us if you're sensitive about accepting help. I'd ignored the email at the time, thinking it was well-meaning but condescending. Now I understood it differently. Brian wasn't offering help. He was fishing for information, trying to confirm the financial narrative Jessica had constructed about my circumstances. Nian. I pulled Brian's social media profiles and found the evidence I was looking for. 3 months ago, he'd posted a photo from a real estate networking event in Beverly Hills. The caption read, "Great insights tonight about identifying emerging property investors in LA. You never know who might be building quietly behind the scenes." Tagged in the photo, Richard Blackstone. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. Brian had met Richard at a networking event, and somehow mentioned his, quote, struggling veteran sister-in-law. Richard, who'd been trying to identify the owner of Martinez property holdings, had made the connection. But instead of exposing me immediately, he'd done his own investigation. Then I found the final piece of evidence in Jessica's Instagram archive. A post from 4 months ago showing a group dinner at an upscale restaurant in Beverly Hills. The caption, "Amazing dinner with Brian's new business contacts. Love meeting successful people who understand real estate investment." In the background of one photo, barely visible but unmistakable, was Richard Blackstone sitting at a corner table. Jessica and Brian hadn't just met Richard randomly at tonight's dinner party. They'd been cultivating a relationship with him for months, probably hoping to benefit from his connections and expertise. What they didn't realize was that their homeless relative was the very person Richard had been trying to reach for his business dealings. I closed my laptop and stared at my reflection in the black screen. My family hadn't just dismissed my capabilities, they'd actively investigated me, hired professionals to verify my supposed failures, and then leveraged my perceived worthlessness to build social connections with successful people. Tomorrow's revelation was going to be even sweeter than I'd imagined. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I dressed like the successful businesswoman I actually was. I put on the tailored suit I'd bought for property closings, the designer heels I wore to investor meetings, and the jewelry I'd purchased with my first major rental income check. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman my family thought they knew. I had a plan, and it was time to execute it with military precision. First, I called Richard Blackstone's office directly. His assistant put me through immediately, confirming that he'd been waiting for my call. "Sophia," Richard's voice was warm with satisfaction. "I was hoping you'd reach out. I have a proposition that might interest you." "Before we discuss business," I said, "I need to understand something." "How long have you known about my connection to Jessica and Brian?" Richard chuckled. "Since about 2 weeks after I met them at that Beverly Hills networking event." Brian mentioned his, quote, struggling veteran sister-in-law who was having housing issues, and I thought it was quite a coincidence that someone in his family shared a name with the elusive property owner I'd been trying to contact. "And you didn't say anything?" "I wanted to see how long they'd maintain the charade. It's been educational, watching them cultivate a business relationship with me, while simultaneously dismissing the very person they should have been celebrating." I felt a grim satisfaction at his words. "What kind of proposition did you have in mind?" "Partnership," Richard said without hesitation. "Your portfolio shows exactly the kind of strategic thinking my company values. But more than that, your veteran housing model is something we'd like to scale. I'm proposing a joint venture, Blackstone Properties and Martinez Holdings, focused on developing affordable housing for military veterans across California." The offer took my breath away. What would that look like? Initial capital investment of $50 million, with your properties as the foundation portfolio. You'd maintain operational control while we provide development resources and expansion capital. Conservative projections show the partnership could be worth over $200 million within 5 years. $200 million. While my family discussed my need for entry-level employment, I was being offered a partnership worth more than everyone at that Thanksgiving dinner would earn in their combined lifetimes. There's one condition, Richard continued. I'd like to announce the partnership publicly. Veterans housing is becoming a major policy issue, and having a combat veteran leading the initiative would be powerful for both business and social impact reasons. Public announcement? Press conference, industry publications, possibly a feature in the Los Angeles Times business section. Local veteran builds real estate empire, partners with major developer, that sort of thing. I thought about Jessica reading that headline over her morning coffee, about Brian explaining to his dental practice colleagues why he'd never mentioned his wealthy sister-in-law, about my parents trying to reconcile the daughter they thought was homeless with the businesswoman featured in major newspapers. I accept, I said. 2 hours later, I was sitting in Blackstone Properties' executive conference room, signing partnership agreements that made me one of the largest individual real estate investors in Los Angeles County. The lawyers explained that the joint venture would manage a portfolio worth over $300 million, with expansion plans into San Francisco, San Diego, and Phoenix. But the moment I treasured most came when Richard handed me the press release draft. There it was in black and white. Sophia Martinez, founder and CEO of Martinez Property Holdings, brings a portfolio of veteran-focused properties valued at $47 million to the partnership. $47 million. That was my individual contribution to a business relationship with one of California's most powerful developers. While Jessica had been explaining to dinner party guests why I couldn't handle basic employment, I'd been building an empire that was now making front-page business news. I signed the final document and looked up at Richard. When do we make the announcement? He smiled. How about tomorrow? I believe your family reads the Los Angeles Times, don't they? For the first time in 3 years, I smiled back with genuine happiness. They do indeed. The Los Angeles Times business section hit newsstands at 6 a.m. on Friday morning. By 6:30, my phone was exploding with calls, texts, and voicemails that painted a picture of my family's complete shock in real time. The headline was everything I'd hoped for. Local veterans' $47 million real estate empire partners with Blackstone Properties in major housing initiative. Below it, a photo of me in my business suit, shaking hands with Richard in front of one of my Beverly Hills properties. The article was comprehensive and glowing. It detailed my military service, my strategic approach to property investment, and my innovative model for veteran housing. But the paragraph that made me smile was this one. Martinez's success story challenges common narratives about veteran employment struggles. While building her real estate portfolio, she maintained a deliberately low profile, leading some family members to believe she was experiencing financial difficulties. My mother called first, her voice a mixture of confusion and awe. Sophia, I don't understand. The newspaper says you own properties worth $47 million. How is that possible? Before I could answer, I heard my father in the background. Let me see that paper again. That's our Sophia? The one who's been unemployed? Jessica's call came 20 minutes later. Her voice was strained, carefully controlled, like someone trying to manage a crisis. Sophia, I just saw the newspaper. I think there might be some kind of mistake. They're saying you own half of Beverly Hills, but that can't be right because you've been staying on couches and… It's not a mistake, Jessica, I said calmly. I own 12 properties in Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, and Santa Monica. I've owned them for 3 years. The silence on the other end was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. But you said you were unemployed. You said you couldn't afford rent. We offered to help you financially. You offered to help someone you assumed was failing, I corrected. I never said I was unemployed. I never said I couldn't afford rent. You made those assumptions based on how I dressed and where you thought I was living. But why would you let us think? Because it revealed who you really are, I said. When you thought I was struggling, you treated me like a charity case and an embarrassment. You used my supposed failures to make yourself feel superior and to build social connections with successful people like Richard. Brian called an hour later, his voice tight with panic. "Sophia, we need to talk. I had lunch with Richard Blackstone yesterday, and he mentioned that you and he have been in business discussions for months. I don't understand how the homeless veteran you hired investigators to research turns out to be his business partner," I finished. Yes, that must be confusing. The sharp intake of breath told me I'd hit my target. "You know about the investigation?" "I know about everything, Brian. The private investigators, the financial inquiries, the way you and Jessica cultivated Richard, hoping to benefit from his success, while simultaneously using my supposed failures as dinner party conversation." By noon, my voicemail was full of messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly eager to reconnect with their successful cousin. The same people who'd nodded sympathetically when Jessica described my struggles were now calling to congratulate me on my amazing business acumen. But the call that mattered most came from Richard at 2 p.m. "How are you handling the family circus?" he asked with amusement. "Better than expected," I said, watching Jessica's number appear on my caller ID for the 5th time. "Though I think Thanksgiving dinner next year is going to be interesting." "Speaking of which," Richard said, "I hope you're prepared for the media attention. CNN wants to interview you about veteran entrepreneurship, and Forbes is interested in a feature about military skills translating to business success." I looked out the window of my Culver City home, the home my family thought didn't exist, and smiled. I think I can handle it. After all, I'd survived 3 tours in Afghanistan. I could definitely survive being successful. 1 year later, I stood on the rooftop terrace of my new headquarters, a gleaming office building in downtown Beverly Hills that housed Martinez Blackstone Veterans Housing Initiative. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see 3 of my original properties, now part of a portfolio worth over $200 million that had housed 847 veterans and their families. The transformation had been remarkable, but not just in terms of business metrics. The partnership with Richard had opened doors I'd never imagined. We'd testified before Congress about veteran housing policy, launched a nonprofit foundation, and developed a replicable model that was being implemented in 12 states. But more than the professional success, I'd discovered something I'd lost somewhere between Afghanistan and Jessica's dining room table: the understanding that my worth wasn't determined by other people's perceptions of my circumstances. The personal costs had been significant but necessary. Jessica and I had managed exactly 3 conversations since the newspaper article, each one more awkward than the last. She'd tried to rewrite history, claiming she'd always known I was special and had only been trying to help. But we both knew the truth. She'd needed me to be failing so she could feel successful by comparison. Brian had handled the revelation even worse. He'd actually called Richard's office trying to pitch real estate investment ideas, apparently believing that his connection to me gave him some kind of business credibility. Richard had politely declined and then called me laughing about it. The rest of my extended family had fallen into predictable patterns. Some had embraced my success with genuine pride and happiness. Others had become suddenly interested in renewing relationships they'd previously neglected. A few had retreated into resentful silence, unable to reconcile their assumptions about veterans with the reality of my achievements. My parents had surprised me most. After the initial shock wore off, they'd sat me down for a conversation that was 3 years overdue. "We failed you," my mother had said simply. "We saw what we expected to see instead of asking what was really happening in your life." My father, never one for emotional speeches, had put it more bluntly. "I was wrong about what your military service prepared you for. I thought it damaged you. I didn't realize it had taught you to build something the rest of us couldn't see." It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Too much damage had been done for that. But it was honest, and it was enough. The moment that mattered most came 3 months ago, when I received a letter from a young Marine who'd just moved into one of our San Diego properties. She'd been living in her car for 6 weeks after her discharge, unable to afford deposits, and struggling with the bureaucracy of civilian housing applications. Our program had placed her in a furnished apartment within 48 hours. No questions asked, no judgment about her circumstances. "Ms. Martinez," she'd written, "I don't know how to thank you for seeing what I needed instead of what I looked like I needed. For the first time since coming home, I feel like someone understands that not all battles end when you take off the uniform. Reading that letter, I understood that the most important victory hadn't been proving my family wrong. It had been proving that success looks different than people expect, and that the most valuable work often happens in the spaces where no one is paying attention. Last week, I got an invitation that made me laugh out loud. Jessica was hosting her annual holiday party and wanted to know if I'd like to attend. The invitation was handwritten on expensive stationery and included a note about how proud the family is of my accomplishments and how she'd, quote, love to introduce me to some people who could benefit from my expertise. I RSVP'd yes, but not for the reasons she probably expected. This time, I was going as exactly who I was. A veteran who'd built something meaningful. A businesswoman who'd earned her success through strategic thinking and hard work. And a person who'd learned that the most important approval you can receive is your own. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons or strategies. They're fought with patience, persistence, and the courage to succeed quietly until the world is ready to see what you've accomplished. Sometimes coming home from war means building a different kind of mission. And sometimes, the family that underestimates you gives you the greatest gift of all, the motivation to prove that their limitations were never yours. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.